it's Elaine again with another review, because I have opinions. Today, about An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. So this book follows a girl named April May who discovers what she initially thinks is an art project on the side of the street in New York. She and a friend make a YouTube video about it, and it goes viral because it turns out it's not just one statue. These giant robot things have appeared in 60 major cities, impossibly quickly and without anyone seeing them set up. Because their video was the first one, April finds herself unexpectedly famous. And when it becomes clear these things are not just an art project, she may end up being an ambassador for the human race. She makes the active choice to make herself into a representative of hope, optimism, and kindness, in opposition of some random asshole who decides to promote a message of fear and defensiveness. This book is about a lot of things. Identity, fame, the innate nature of humanity, a giant impossible alien robot. But this book reminds me of a story that one of my classmates was writing in our senior thesis class in college. I don't want to give too much away in case he wants to or has published it somewhere, but they shared a similar premise of something impossible happening to the entire world at once, examining how it affects humanity in different cultures. One of the differences was Glenn's project focused on humanity as a whole. It was mostly short vignettes from characters we saw once and then never again, giving a broad view of the different ways people were reacting. We, as a class, discussed whether the story needed a core protagonist to focus in on, and Glenn didn't particularly want one, because adding one would make the story feel less about the premise and more about the person. That's what An Absolutely Remarkable Thing is. Yeah, the premise is about Carl, the robot, but the story is objectively about April. It's about how these events shape her and her life. Personally, I like that. I tend to be far more interested in people books than premises. That being said, though, this is an idea-heavy book. Hank Green uses the first-person perspective to really explore ideas and philosophy. A lot more of this book is about fame than anything else. And at first I expected myself to not really like that, because I've always sort of judged the desire for fame. Like, I tend to think mean thoughts when I hear people want to grow up and be famous, which I know is a bit ridiculous considering I'm making this in a video for YouTube, but I have ulterior motives, which, if you have not looked at any of the other posts that talk about this, it's because I'm trying to get published, and it seems to get published, one of the easiest routes nowadays is to have a platform first, which made it sort of rather meta, but I've always understood the desire for the peripheral parts of fame. Like, I understand the desire for money, respect, permission to behave badly. But this book really focuses on the platform aspect of fame. Fame means that people care what you say. And therefore your message gets out there. You can't control what people think, but because your voice is being heard, you can control what they think about. And that is something I very much can understand the desire for. April finds herself in a position where her words matter. And even though she is almost worryingly calculated about it, she fights to make sure her words keep being heard, and she is saying the right thing. And yeah, as someone trying to get a book published, I really understood that. I still found April as a protagonist occasionally difficult to like. Some of her flaws felt a little like they were put there so that the character would be flawed. Like, conceptually the book needed a flawed protagonist, so here, let's throw in some flaws. Other times I had trouble because I could hear Hank Green's voice too clearly, and April did not feel like him. So it created this weird cognitive dissonance for me. It was like I was listening to Hank Green read the book while wearing an April mask. I have no idea if I would have that effect if I didn't know Hank Green's internet persona so well. So your mileage may vary on that one. And a weird side shoot of that, which is interesting also because this book is focused on the act of building persona, especially in the first half of the book, I found myself excessively interested in the moments that don't sound like Hank's internet persona. I found myself actively thinking like, oh, does Hank think this way? Rather than just accepting that April does think this way. And I sort of hate that I did that. Because I am perpetually afraid that people will interpret my characters as me, and I know that a lot of authors actively go out there trying to make characters that are unlike them. And it's one of those things that has always annoyed me in interviews and things when I hear people just assuming that a character represents the author's point of view. And that's sort of what I was doing without intending to in this book. But once again, I think that's because I know Hank Green's internet persona so well. Basically, this is what I don't like about reading books by people that I know a lot about. But the fact that the book is so focused on building identities, it made me hyper aware of Hank Green's identity within and outside of this book. It's not necessarily a problem. I think a lot of people would find it interesting to, like, examine. It's just not something I want on my mind when I'm trying to fall into a narrative. Also, for me, it did sort of fall away as the book progressed. Like, I lost more of Hank as the book progressed and stopped thinking about it. Though now that I'm doing this video in retrospect, so often everything I say, my brain is going back to. And is that true for Hank Green? How much of his persona is built? How much is really him? And, like, I like books that make me think. I don't want that to be what I take away from this book. The other thing I really want to talk about in this review is the topical current nature of this book. This book does something that a lot of writing classes directly tell you not to. It uses language, images, and even memes that are very current. It doesn't use too much slang, per se, but I'm pretty sure that if you don't spend a pretty good amount of time on the internet, and more specifically, the same areas of the internet as Hank Green, there's gonna be a lot that goes over your head. It's like, you know, when you're away from the internet for a couple weeks and miss the early days of a meme and come back and see it, and you get that it's a meme, but you sort of don't get why it's funny or meaningful? I suspect that a lot of people who don't spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours online on the same websites Hank Green does, that's how they're gonna feel about this book. Which made me really curious as to how it will hold up to the test of time. In school, I read a book about a girl who went away to college in the distant year of 2000. The book was written in the 80s. But she was going to a college called Moon U, which was actually on the moon. And she was so angry about this because she didn't want to go to a school called Moon U because everyone's just going to make fun of her because she's going to Moon U. And it was one of those books that just felt so dated. Like, everything about it felt dated. And, like, part of the reason was, yes, I was reading the book in 1999 or 98, somewhere around that time, and it was set in 2000, and in this version of 2000, like, there was a university on the fucking moon. But, like, also it had 80s slang, and just, like, the way it was written was so 80s. It was the first time I remember reading something and going, oh, that's why you don't use slang. Because it just took you out of the story when you're listening to a girl saying it's bogus to have to go to Moon U. And, like, it undercut any kind of tension whatsoever, because all I could think about was how ridiculous it was. I don't feel like this book is going to be another Moon U, but it's sort of impossible to tell until later. I will say it feels like the kind of book that if people are still reading it in 20 years, there will need to be footnotes explaining some of the shit. It's just very much a book of this exact time. And not just meme-wise and things like that. There's a lot in this book that really cuts to some of the questions of our era, like whose voices do deserve to be heard? Does everyone's voice deserve to be heard? Are we innately a species of hope and optimism, or innately a species of violence and fear? There are lots of stuff, there's a buttload of stuff about misinformation in this. Like, there's a lot that hits really hard to this exact moment. But because of that, I worry how it will hit any other time. Will we still have these worries then? Will we still understand this book? And one of the things that I thought about repeatedly when I was reading this book was, this feels like a book that if you wrote it in a writing class, everyone would tell you you are wrong for writing it. Everyone would tell you, like, this is too topical, this is too meme culture, this is too that, this is too focused on identity. And I'm not sure it's a problem. I actually said to my mom about this book that I'm pretty sure it would not have been published if it weren't by someone who was already relatively internet famous. But that's not because it was a bad book. I think it's a good book, and I'm glad that Hank is famous enough to have gotten it published. It's just not the book that I feel like most people expect to find. I'm also a little bit worried that the ultimate ending of the entire series cannot possibly live up to the setup. But, I mean, I've got to reserve judgment on that until I read the second book. Overall, I think I'd say an absolutely remarkable thing is innately readable, intensely readable, very enjoyable, quick, and thought-provoking. So, worth a read.